Okay, I think I'll begin. So last lecture we looked at evolutionary innovation, in particular how complex structures evolve. And what I want to do today is look at the other end of the evolutionary spectrum, and that's the nature of extinction. And so death of the dinosaurs is actually going to be only part of the lecture, but we're going to talk about death of the dinosaurs, and then after about 2/3 of the lecture, Elliot's going to take over and tell us whence the meteorite came from that seemed to do in the dinosaurs. So then just reminding you where we are, we looked at the evolution of complex life, and now we're going to look at mass extinctions and extinction in general. And then we're going to move on to looking at sort of our climate change, and then, well, actually, I guess next week, actually, we've got this flipped. Oh, Thursday, I keep on. Yeah. Next Thursday, we'll start looking at the geologic, biological, and astronomical drivers of climate change. And then next week, we're going to have two guest lecturers who are going to talk about the emergence of humans, the genus Homo, Tim White, and then Leslie Hlusko is going to look at how we expanded out of Africa to settle the Earth. So that'll be next week. So just a reminder that you should have now signed up for one of the Paleontology Museum tours starting tomorrow. Sorry? For next, I'll do that tomorrow. I'll do that. Yeah, thanks. And also, this is my first ever Halloween pumpkin that we carved a couple of years ago. Finally decided I should do one. It took a long time for people to work out. They walk past and go, I don't know what it is. Can you see what it is? You got it? It's from the side, right? There's the nostril, the teeth, the jaws. Okay, so nerd Halloween pumpkins. Also, it's not yet confirmed, but probably on Saturday the 8th, that's not this coming Saturday, but the next Saturday, we'll be running a field trip to the California Academy of Sciences to get behind the scenes to look at their collections, and then you can spend the rest of the day in the Academy. So I'll announce that by email once we get proper confirmation of the date for that trip. Okay, so this lecture, I first actually want to look at the diversification of tetrapods on land briefly, and then mass extinctions and extinction in general, and then the death of the dinosaurs in particular, and then Elliot's going to take over and tell us about the sources of meteorites and the poor demise of Pluto. So, diversification of tetrapods on land. And so this is a complicated diagram. I don't want you to remember the details, but it's a cladogram showing the major vertebrate groups. So it starts off with the first fish that had no jaws. Then there are the jawed fish that lead quite quickly to things like sharks. And then there are the bony fish, which your goldfish and tuna and all sorts of other fish are. And what we did last time is looked at, on this part of the cladogram, evolution of fins with bone and muscle in them. And that's a precursor to the invasion of land. And so we looked at the coelacanth, and I mentioned the lungfish, and then we looked at the first amphibians, the first things that climbed up on land. And so I just remind you from last time, we spent a little bit of time with this fellow Acanthostega with its 8 digits rather than 5. It has 4 feet. It's a tetrapod, but it looked like it lived and reproduced in the water. It's got a tail fin. It's got a full set of gills not shown here. And it's got a sensory system that only works in the water called lateral lines. So they're going back there. So everything else here is called an amniote. And amniotes are differentiated from amphibians and the fish because they no longer need water to reproduce. How many of you heard of amniotic fluid? Right? So that's the water trapped within the amnion, which is the envelope that keeps the embryo moist, given that reproduction is no longer in the water. And so the evolution of the amniotic egg meant that these guys could invade land. And that occurred not too long after, as far as we can tell, the origin of the first tetrapods. A bit hard to tell because eggs don't fossilize well. So you have to use indirect evidence. So I just want to highlight just two groups here now. The first one is one of the first groups to branch off are the mammals. And so we're a very deep lineage within terrestrial vertebrates. And I've got here this fellow here called Dimetrodon. And this is Dimetrodon fossils here. Not a dinosaur. In fact, not only is it not a dinosaur, it's more closely related to you than it is to dinosaurs or any other reptile. So this is in our direct ancestry, not in the ancestry of dinosaurs or pterosaurs or anything else. And there are lots of reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into it in this lecture, except to say that this is the eye socket here, and this opening here we actually have as well. This bar here is your cheekbone. And what's happened in us is this opening actually is extended all the way and they meet at the top. But anyway, that's a rather complicated argument that I won't go into any further here. But this is a proto-mammal. The other group I want to mention, just because it's fun, is the ichthyosaurs. You'll be seeing a fossil ichthyosaur in section this week. Means fish lizard. And so here's a rather spectacular fossil of one of these things from Germany. Huge eye, looks like they fed in the inky depths. Highly modified fins for swimming. And then here, what do we have here? So it looks like an embryo. So it looks like that she was fossilized giving birth. Right? There's the hip bones there. And there's this coming out. So it's pretty interesting, right? So now, for this case, we absolutely know the sex of this individual. Notice there's the hip bone there. In fact, we suspect actually she did not die giving birth, but actually something subtly different. If she died giving birth this way, then I can't see why the embryo just wouldn't have got washed away somewhere. So it turns out that what happens when animals die is they bloat, and they build up enormous pressure inside. And so the thought is what happened is that she was pregnant, the embryo was inside here, and as she rotted, the gases forced the embryo out. And so she was about to give birth, but was not fossilized, actually giving birth. And this bloating of large animals is well known. And so here is a sperm whale on a truck in Taiwan on its way to a marine institute. And what happened is it exploded and spewed its guts on someone's poor moped. So you can see there's the split mark there. So pregnant whales that beach, the embryos often get forced out by the gas that builds up. And my undergraduate honour supervisor had a friend killed dissecting a whale on a beach in New Zealand. He was dissecting with an axe and it exploded and a piece of rib went through him. So it's really can be quite dangerous. So keep distance of rotting whales. Okay, so that's just gratuitous fun. So what is interesting, and I'm not going to deal with it in any detail, but we talked about the Cambrian explosion when most of the animal body plans arose quite quickly, about 550 million years ago. There's a vertebrate equivalent of that occurs in the Triassic, which is in the order of 250, 245, 210 million years ago, where pretty much every major living terrestrial group originates. So the first true mammals are in the Triassic. The first turtles are in the Triassic. The first ichthyosaurs are in the Triassic. Blue is for extinct. The first plesiosaurs, and you'll see a juvenile plesiosaur in section this week, occur in the Triassic. The first lizards in the Triassic. The first crocodiles in the Triassic, and they were enormously diverse compared to today. The first pterosaurs, things like Pteranodon and Pterodactylus, of which you'll see in the lab as well, in the Triassic. The first Saurischian dinosaurs in the Triassic, the things that led to T-Rex. The first ornithischian dinosaurs, the duckbills and the horned dinosaurs, in the Triassic. So there's this incredible burst of innovation that is not generally well understood, but all these major groups occur at that time. It's just after the end Permian mass extinction, which we'll get to shortly, and it may be that the clearing of the ecological space laid the ground, the evolutionary opportunity for these major groups. So there are really only two groups on this diagram that did not emerge in the Triassic. The first one are the snakes, that are basically or simply legless lizards. So they originated somewhat later. In fact, there are many legless lizard groups that evolved, one of which we call snakes, and the others which we call legless lizards. And then the other one are the birds that emerged in the Jurassic about 60 or 70 million years later. And you'll see the first fossil bird in lab as well, Archaeopteryx. And so I'm going to talk about dinosaur extinction, but in some respects, technically, that's a bogus term. Dinosaurs are still alive and well today. They're called birds. So the nearest living relatives of the birds are the meat-eating dinosaurs, T-Rex and a bunch of things like that. So the dinosaurs did not become extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. One group survived, and we happen to call them birds. And the evidence for this relationship is now utterly overwhelming in terms of the morphology. So some of my colleagues would get cranky at me by talking about the dinosaur extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, given that there are some survivors of it. Okay, so I'm not going to say anything more about it, except that it's a remarkable time with a lot of remarkable groups that emerged quite rapidly. So now what I want to do is talk about mass extinctions and extinction in general, and then we'll move to the death of the dinosaurs. And so a question for you first, given extinction, is how long do you think on average a species lasts? And I ran out of colors. I wanted to put 20,000 years here. So is it 200 million years? Does a single species last? Or is it 20 million? Or is it 2? Or is it 200,000? Or if you want to put all four colors up, 20,000 years. So what do you think? So any instincts? Okay, what have we got so far? We've got a lot of green, we've got a lot of blue, we've got some white, no red, a couple of red. Okay. The average duration is in the order of about 2 million years. If you're a mouse, that means 2 million generations. If you're a human, that's more like 200,000 generations. So that's a lot of grandmas, right? So that's the sort of duration that we're looking at. It's an average. The duration of species is like radioactive decay. So if half of them die at 2 million years, a quarter die at 4, an eighth at 6, a 16th at 8, etc., etc. So there are some species that last 20 million years or longer. And there are a lot that live more like 1 million years. So human durations, if someone lives to 100, you don't expect someone to be at 200 or 300 or 400. But for species, you expect that. If the average is 2 million, there's a lot of them that get to 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. It's like radioactive decay is the way the lifetimes work. So that gives you a sense. Now, how long ago was the Cambrian explosion? About 500 million years. So that's about 250 average species durations. Right? So that means then there's been an awful lot of extinction in the history of life. And so this diagram here shows the percent extinction in roughly 5 million year intervals from about 500 million years ago to the recent. And so there's the scale at the top. The maximum there is at 60%. So every 5 million years, this is sort of the degree of extinction that we find. And this is actually at the genus level, not the species. So the African elephant has one genus, one species. The Indian elephant, one genus, one species. Canis, the dog, has 3 species. The domestic dog, the coyote, and the wolf. And the dire wolf, which you'll see today. So that has several species. There are 3 species of giraffe. So a genus is a small collection of species. How many species of Homo are there? Anybody know? Homo sapiens, us. Homo neanderthalis, Neanderthal man, Homo erectus, Homo habilis. So about 4 for us. So a genus is in the order of 4, 5, 10, 1, 15 species. And this is based on the really rich fossil record of things in the ocean. But it's similar for the terrestrial things. So first of all, extinction is a dominant feature of the history of life, and paleontologists like to point out that basically 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. About 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. And when you think of your own family line, most of your relatives are now dead. Your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents, your great-great-great-great-grandparents, your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, all the way back to 0 AD and all the way back to 4,000, 10,000, 200,000 years ago. So most of your relatives are dead. Most species are gone. Similar idea. What is interesting, and I'm not going to deal with it in any detail here, but the extinction rates are higher, and as one gets closer to the present, the percent extinction slowly drops, which means on average species are longer lived the closer you get to the recent. So these species durations are quite short, and then slowly they get longer and longer and longer, which suggests that on average they're getting better at being in the world if they're being more persistent. The duration is going from a couple of million years to 3 or 4 million years, for example. The Cambrian, when the animal phyla are being established, when the first ecosystems are being established, when the arms race is being established, the extinction rates are really high. Species are very short-lived, and often very bizarre. So evolution in the Cambrian was going incredibly fast. And then important for this lecture then is after the Cambrian, there are what we call the big 5 mass extinctions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where the extinction rate sits up well above the background. Well, not really true for the Devonian. But for the end Cretaceous, that's when the dinosaurs went extinct, that extinction rate is a lot higher than the extinction rate on either side of it. So that suggests that something special happened. And so it looks like 3 of them at least, something special happened. The end Ordovician, the end Permian, and the end Cretaceous. And so what I want to do now is briefly look at these 5 big mass extinctions and explain to you a little bit about what we know about what caused the extinction. It turns out in detail, we really don't know what caused most species to become extinct in the fossil record. It's been annoyingly difficult to work out what's going on. It's a prevalent feature of the fossil record, and yet we can't tell you why things go extinct, which is really frustrating. So I want to deal with the end Ordovician mass extinction. Now, first of all, there is 0 extinction on land, none. So what's special about the land where there's no extinction on land? Anybody know what's special about the land in the Ordovician? There's nothing there yet. The plants haven't got there yet, and the late Devonian is when the first tetrapods get there, and just a little bit earlier, the first insects. So the land at this point has not been colonized by animals or plants. There are almost certainly bacteria there. There may have been fungi there. We don't have a record of them. So it's about a 57% genus extinction. I don't expect you to memorize the numbers, but that means about half the genera, which suggests something like 2/3 of the species disappeared. 2/3 of the species gone. Reefs and trilobites got hit especially hard. 67% of the genera disappeared forever, never to be seen again. The hypothesized cause is a major glaciation with ice volumes in order of 2 to 5 times the last ice age, dropped sea level draining shallow tropical seas present at that time. And so this is a paleogeographic reconstruction of the Ordovician. It's pretty hard to recognize anything. This is North America. This is the Proto-Appalachians. This is the Cincinnati region in here. This is California. I mean, we're in the deep ocean still. There's nothing out there yet here. The continent hasn't grown that far yet. But most of the continents are covered with very, very shallow seas, and in the case of North America, it's sitting right on the tropics. So it's like the Bahamas writ large. This spectacular shallow seas with thousands of kilometers of ocean. And so the species richness is very, very high there. You freeze a lot of seawater into an ice cap that started to form in here, and the sea level drops several hundred meters, 600 or 700, 800 feet. And those seas basically just empty out. And everything dependent on the shallow warm waters then goes extinct. So it looks like that's the probable cause of the end Ordovician mass extinction. And our latest assistant professor in integrative biology is a geologist who did some of his training at Caltech, where he used the latest stable isotopic techniques to actually measure the ice volume, which is really spectacular work. So you can actually measure the ice volume now to show that the sea level drop was enough to empty the seas. And so here's just a diagram of the extent of the ice sheet. So it covered Africa and a good chunk of South America, and the center of the ice sheet was sitting in here on the continents down here. There's a question.
Can you explain by 60% of genera, you said 50%, 10% of genus, but 2/3 of the species?
Yeah, so if I take the genus Canis, that's one genus. But in order for the genus Canis to go extinct, I've got to drive coyotes extinct and wolves extinct. So that's two species get driven extinct with one genus going extinct. Does that make sense? So the genus extinction rate is lower than the species extinction rate, unless every genus had just one species in it. So the giraffe's genus has 3 species in it. So to drive the giraffe genus extinct, you've got to wipe out 3 species of giraffe. So that's what I mean when I say the species rate's a little bit higher than the genus rate. Ants are crazy. The biggest that came out of nowhere. The biggest genus of ant has 1,000 species in it. So it's really hard to wipe a genus of ant out because you've got to wipe out a lot of individuals and a lot of species to wipe the genus out. So that's an extreme case. Okay. So now the next one is the late Devonian mass extinction. It doesn't seem to stand out that much, and so it's one of these ones which is on the edge, and it's really peculiar. So first of all, the extinction rate is much lower. It's only 1/3, which is still an unbelievably high number. We're causing a lot of extinctions now, Homo sapiens, in the modern world, and we'll look at this in a couple of lectures from now, but the percent extinctions that we're causing is trivial compared to these extinction rates. So these completely swamp the rate of the magnitude of extinction that have been caused by humans. It's a protracted event that occurs over several million years. But what's really bizarre is the loss of species is largely driven by a decreased origination rate, not an increased extinction rate. So Europe's population at the moment is slowly dropping. Why is Europe's population slowly dropping? Is it because the death rate's going up in Europe? No, the death rate of anything is getting slightly longer, right? So why is the population in Europe dropping? There aren't enough children. They don't have enough children to replace them. So if I have an extinction rate that's just happening all the time, the loss of species, but I'm not regenerating new ones, the total diversity is going to slowly drop. Right? That's what happened in the end Devonian. So it's called a mass extinction, but it's not really a mass extinction. It's a failure to produce new species. There are some, but not as many. And so the diversity drops by about by a third, simply by a failure to replace species that are going extinct. And we do not understand why or how that's happening. But it turns out that most extinctions in the fossil record are actually caused by elevated extinction rates and decreased origination rates. We published a paper last year in Science demonstrating that. Yeah, question?
How do you know that there is decreased origination? It's a study possible.
Yeah, we just count the fossil record when it's rich. Remember, when the fossil record is rich, it's really rich, and so you just look at the rate at which new species appear. These data are based on 31,500 genera is captured in this, so it's actually quite a lot of data. And you just look at the rate of regeneration of genera within geologic time. Okay. The cause is quite unclear, but next lecture I'll give a hint as to what's going on. But it's one of the most disputed ones. We really don't know. And pretty much every idea has been put out there. Too hot, too cold, too much oxygen, not enough oxygen. It just goes on and on. Okay, so there's the late Devonian world, and this is the world that the first forests emerge, and it's also the world that the vertebrates invade land. And there's North America, again, there sitting right on the tropics. Okay, the end Permian mass extinction is the biggest mass extinction in the history of life. Well, of complex life. We don't know if there were giant extinctions when the oxygen first arose 2.5 billion years ago. So it's the biggest mass extinction where we have a fossil record. Some groups had 90% extinction, which is unbelievable extinction rates. And there's the extinction rate there. This is called the Paleozoic era. After this is the Mesozoic and then the Cenozoic. So what happens is geologic time is divided up into these three big chunks based on the two biggest mass extinctions, the end Permian and the end Cretaceous. It completely reshaped the biosphere. So if you're in the fossil record, you know anything about the fossil record, you can tell immediately whether you're in the Paleozoic or whether you're in the post-Paleozoic. If it's trilobites, you're in the Paleozoic. If there's a dinosaur, a turtle, a pterosaur, a snake, a bird, a lizard, you're in the post-Paleozoic. An ichthyosaur, a plesiosaur, you're in the post-Paleozoic. So you know immediately where you are in geologic time based on that. The hypothesized cause is CO2 poisoning. It's not sure. And so a question I have for you then is, yes, I was going to say yes. First, this is the world during the end Permian mass extinction. It's the time of the supercontinent Pangaea that we looked at many lectures ago. And so it's a very, very peculiar world. The continent spans from north to south, basically cutting off circulation from one side of this ocean to the other side at the back. These are the fragments that are going to become China a little bit later. And so one of the questions is to what extent the mass extinction is tied to the really peculiar geometry of the continents at the time. We don't know. So the question is, what rare event might have caused CO2 poisoning? Now, why do I say rare event? Why does it have to be rare? Yeah, more simpler than that. The answer is quite simply is that this is the biggest mass extinction by a lot, and there's only one of them, so you expect the cause to be unusual. Otherwise, we'd have mass extinctions of that magnitude all the time. So it has to be something really peculiar that happened at that time to cause that extinction. So, volcanoes, meteorites, seafloor spreading, magnetic reversal. So what do you think? So meteorites, it has been proposed. What else have we got? Volcanoes, it has been proposed. Magnetic reversal has been proposed. Seafloor spreading hasn't been proposed. You guys are on track with the rest of the scientific community. Well done. Looks like it's volcanoes. But that's peculiar. There are volcanoes all the time. So what's special about the end Permian as opposed to normal time? So this is a diagram we've seen before with the inner core, which is solid, the liquid outer core that's rotating, producing the Earth's magnetic field, the mantle that is made of rock but flows, and heat convecting, producing crust that moves. And then we have these plumes of mantle that erupt. So these hot spots where mantle plumes penetrate the crust, where's one place in the world we have one of those? Hawaii, right, perfect. So these crop up on the globe, and it turns out that at the end Permian, there's something called the Siberian traps. They are this vast eruption of lava covering, you can see, a good chunk of Siberia. They would have covered California with molten rock to a depth of 1.5 to 6 miles. From San Diego all the way up to Arcata, all the way to the High Sierra, in 6 miles of rock. How high's Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in California? 14,000 feet. So what's that, about 3 miles? So you fill up all of California and then perhaps twice again. All the way from the Sierra to the coast, all the way to the Oregon border, all the way down to San Diego. So that is an enormous flooding of mantle material coming up onto the crust again. And so that is thought to be the trigger for it. So it's volcanoes, but of a rather unusual kind. This traps things actually is a corruption of, I think, a Swedish word meaning steps. The lava flows come out and they form these steps on the landscape. And so they're called the Siberian steppes, and which has been permuted into English as traps. So that's the term comes from actually well, never mind, we'll get to that in a moment. So it turns out that the background's changed. Well, it doesn't matter. Next slide will show it. These are called large igneous provinces, and it turns out there are a bunch of them that have erupted in the world. So actually these giant outpourings are not all that unusual. Notice that Hawaii doesn't even get on the map. So Hawaii is considered utterly trivial and doesn't even appear. There's the Siberian traps there. The biggest one is this one here. So there are quite a lot of these on the globe over the last 500 million years or so. And so one of the questions is, why does it produce a mass extinction? Did any of the rest of these? And so the answer is, it looks like the Siberian volcanics erupted through coal and limestone. Coal is made of carbon. Limestone is calcium carbonate. It's made of carbon and oxygen and calcium. And so it looks like these lavas basically melted the coal and the rock, burnt it, injecting enormous quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere, perhaps 20 times what we have today. And that CO2 causes massive global warming. The CO2 dissolves into the ocean. And a lot of the species that go extinct look like they're particularly sensitive to CO2 poisoning. So the volcanism, given where it happens, produces huge amounts of CO2 that then causes massive global warming and causes extinctions both on land and in the ocean. And that's the rough mechanism as far as we understand it. So the next extinction is the late Triassic, which is a more feeble event. It's again a protracted event occurring over several million years, and again it looks like it's due to a failure to originate, not elevated extinction. It's a little bit of both. And so part of the reason why it's protracted is because it takes a while for populations to drop if you don't generate new ones. Its cause we don't know, but we suspect it may also be these large igneous provinces. Sorry, this is annoying me. There we go. Giant mantle plumes, large igneous provinces known as lips. So actually, look in this diagram. These guys here are connected with green arrows, with green lines, but they're quite separated, but they occur at the same time. Why are they linked? Any idea why they're linked? Yeah.
Were they in the same place back when they happened?
Yeah, they were in the same place when they happened. There's seafloor spreading happening, so all of these were in the same place. This is on either side of the mid-Atlantic ridge. They were in the same place. And then those big lava deposits have been moved apart. And so there are 3 of them that occur when the Atlantic was forming. And that one is called CAMP, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, and it's thought that that might be related to the extinction. We don't know for sure. And then finally I want to get to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. It was especially huge given the background rate on either side of it, about 47% extinction in the ocean. Some groups disappeared forever, like the dinosaurs, excluding the birds, ammonites. Oh, I didn't correct that. That's an error. That's sudden. I'm sorry. That one should be sudden. And it reshaped the biosphere completely. One of the ways that it reshaped the biosphere is it wiped out the dinosaurs, but mammals persisted, and we'll get to that in just a moment. And so the hypothesized cause is a meteorite impact. So here's the world just not long before the dinosaurs went extinct. Again, the continents are flooded. An excellent fossil record of dinosaurs in North America because of the flooding of the continent. And this is at the time of the end Cretaceous where the sea is receding. And so now what I'm going to do is look at the dinosaurs, the death of dinosaurs in particular. So here's a diagram then. Dinosaurs emerge about 225 million years ago and persist for 165 million years and then become extinct at the end Cretaceous. Mammals originate 225 million years ago and persist for 165 million years in the shadow of the dinosaurs. And it's only when the dinosaurs go that mammals then start to emerge as, well, somewhat larger body forms. So it looks like the dinosaurs were keeping the mammals down ecologically, and only with the dinosaurs eliminated were mammals that had been there all along emerged to become the dominant vertebrates in the terrestrial realm. The implication is enormously important and deep. If there hadn't been a mass extinction, the world might still be dominated by dinosaurs. And the mammals would still be small little ratty things running around in the shadow of them. So that suggests that this rare event, this freak event of this meteorite impact, completely reshaped the evolutionary trajectory of the world. Question?
If the mass extinction couldn't have happened, could the dinosaurs eventually evolve to become intelligent like humans?
So the question is, if the mass extinction hasn't happened, could dinosaurs have emerged with intelligence? And the answer is possibly. And there are some paleontologists who have even drawn pictures of the beast with big eyes, etc. So it has been fantasized that there would have been sentient dinosaurs at some point. So it's a good question. Very hard to answer, which shows you how hard it is to do evolutionary science. I want to try to emphasize the duration of the dinosaurs. It is more accurate to have cavemen living with T-Rex than it is having T-Rex living with Stegosaurus. To have cavemen with T-Rex is only an error of 66 million years. Having T-Rex living with Stegosaurus is an error of 100 million years. So it's more accurate to have humans with T-Rex than T-Rex with Stegosaurus.
That's still inaccurate.
It's still hopelessly inaccurate. It's ridiculous. But I'm trying to emphasize the incredible duration of dinosaurs. And how relatively recently we arrive on the scene. So, there are some volcanoes that erupted, the Deccan Traps in India, that may have had a role in the extinction we don't know. And there's some very exciting work coming out of Berkeley. I've just been reviewing the papers coming out of the geology department, suggesting a link between the two, and we'll have to wait for that. It's really very, very cool. So, the bolide impact is the running hypothesis. Though interesting, most dinosaur paleontologists reject the idea. They think the dinosaurs were going extinct before that happened. I don't see it myself, but that's what they argue. So if you had a lecture from another faculty member in this department, in my department, you would get a different story. So just so you're aware of that. So these are rocks in southern France. There's the layers piling up. There's this little pale blue level here. There's a band there above it. If I zoom into a different locality, this is the... So I was going to say, so this here is a clay layer laid down. It's the ejecta blanket of the meteorite. So the meteorite struck, blew dust and muck into the atmosphere that rained down globally. And this is where it sits geologically, and it's chemically weird, and it bleaches the rock underneath it. And so here's the clay layer at the tip of my hammer here, and this rock here that's just chocolate-coloured is the same rock as this without the fossils. So this is full of microfossils. This has hardly any microfossils in it, and they're really, really tiny. And then the biosphere recovers again, and microfossils start appearing again in abundance and in size. So there's an extinction event happening there, and then a loss of most of the fossils, and then the biosphere recovers again. This is the most famous picture. The brilliant white rock is because it's made almost entirely of microfossils. This is the clay layer. And then here's the rock above it with hardly any fossils in it, and then the fossils re-emerge again. This is an Italian coin. This is the Alvarez section in Gubbio in Italy. And what they were doing is measuring the iridium concentration in this clay to try to work out what the duration of the deposition was. Was it 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 1 million years or 10 million years? And what they discovered is the iridium anomaly in this clay was completely off the charts. Iridium basically only comes from outer space. Only comes from outer space, essentially, because almost all the iridium on the surface of the planet has sunk to the core when the planet first formed. And so here's a diagram showing the burst of iridium inside the clay. And what was staggering is they first found it in Italy, and then New Zealand, and then Denmark, and then globally. So it looks like there was an injection of an enormous amount of meteoritic material that covered the entire globe precisely at the end of the Cretaceous, precisely. And that's what led to the hypothesis that a giant meteorite about the size of Mount Everest struck the Earth at that time. Now, we didn't know the size of it until we found the crater, and we covered that a few lectures ago. There's the size of the crater. It looks like it struck in Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The crater size is what gives you the volume of the meteorite. It looks like it struck in the shallow ocean at that time. The green is the land. And a few lectures ago, we looked at the fact that the meteor edge is almost impossible to see in satellite pictures because it's filled in with sediment and fossils. But if you look at a gravity map, you can see the rim of the crater. The rock's compacted, so it's denser, so it's got a little more gravity, so you can pick up the edge of it. And also the water flowing from the highlands here, well, they're not that high, from the highlands here, hit the crater wall and then come to the surface. So there are a lot of these white dots of springs that are coming up on that buried crater edge. And so there's just artist impressions of the meteorite impact. And we have evidence of this sort of thing that Elliot will talk to you about briefly soon. And then what we don't know is we think it's just one meteorite because there's only one giant crater. It may have been several of them. It may have broken up into bits. We don't know for sure. It looks like it's just one, but it could be more. Calculations have been done of the tidal waves that would have been created, and there are tidal wave deposits all around the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico where it struck. The earthquakes would have been magnitude about 10 or 11 or 12. It's absolutely phenomenal. In fact, it's thought that earthquake energy is what may have accelerated the eruption of the Deccan Traps in India, which is kind of interesting. Other evidence includes things called tektites. The impact is so intense it sprays beads of molten rock into the atmosphere. And then a little bit like the video that Elliot showed early on with a bucket of water that was thrown into the freezing air that came down as snow. This molten rock, instead of molten water, flies into the air and it freezes into little beads that then fall back to Earth as glass spherical objects. In Haiti, they're about a foot thick. There's a layer of a foot thick of these glass beads. And they occur all around in the Caribbean and southern Texas. So molten material that just rain back down again around it. So the global iridium anomaly, which is lighter, that falls on top of the glass beads, tidal wave deposits, the crater. So overwhelming evidence of this massive impact. Now, how big was it, say, compared to the largest volcanic eruptions? So these are actually spheres showing the volume of rock thrown into the atmosphere by large eruptions. So, I can't find it. There it is. Mount St. Helens at 1/4 of a cubic kilometre, 1980. It's really tiny. Mount Pinatubo. Anybody know that name in the Philippines in the 90s? There's Mount Pinatubo. How about Krakatoa? There's Krakatoa there. Mount Vesuvius that Pliny describes, 79 AD, that buried Herculaneum with the buried things, right? At about 3.3 cubic kilometers. Now remember, these are spheres. So if the diameter is twice as large, the volume is 8 times. So it's a little bit misleading here. Then there's some really big ones. Crater Lake up in the Sierras. Huge eruption in Yellowstone almost 1 million years ago. And then the biggest eruption in the last 1 million years is this thing, Lake Toba in Sumatra in Indonesia. And this is a small portion of the lake that is filled in the crater. So it's absolutely spectacular. So there's an island that's formed as the volcano is regrowing. And so this is about a fifth of the lake. So it goes around and up, all the way back, and then down the other side again. So those are the biggest eruptions. So there's Toba. And so this is our estimate of the volume for the Chicxulub, which is the name of the end Cretaceous event. Oops. At about 22,000 cubic kilometers of material. So that's about 100,000 Mount St. Helens. So imagine 100,000 Mount St. Helens going off simultaneously. And so it's not clear how, but it's thought it will have affected the short-term climate on the Earth in a rather drastic way, which probably drove the extinctions. And it's interesting, the groups that survive the best are species that survive on detritus, decayed plant material. They survive fairly well. Things that have specialized diets all went extinct. So it suggests that maybe the food chain collapsed, and only things that could survive on the most generalized food substances were able to survive. Large species were hit especially hard, like the dinosaurs. So question.
So was the size of the impact influenced by the actual location, like in the Yucatan Peninsula, or would it have been similar to any?
The size of the impact would have been the same regardless of where it hit. It's, but it looks like it was limestone. It was sulfur-rich. So it looks like it would have put a lot of acid in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of sulfuric acid would have been produced. So had it hit basalt, that wouldn't have happened. So it would have affected the chemistry of what got thrown into the atmosphere. But the size would have been about the same. Yeah.
Were most of the animals killed because of the immediate impact or because of the resulting?
So the question is, are most of the animals killed by the impact itself or by the after effects of it? Well, it's only one small crater on the entire globe, and the extinction is global. So it looks like the number of species killed by the impact itself was probably relatively small. Maybe in North America, some of them were killed directly by it. But the fact that the extinction was in the oceans as well and everywhere suggests it was the aftermath that did most of the killing, probably by blocking out the sun with this blanket of debris that was in the atmosphere that rained down across the globe. Or maybe warming afterwards, it's hard to know. So it's an open area of research. We don't know. So the last question. So then finally, just coming full circle before we now look at where that meteorite came from. Question there.
How long was the blanket of ash block out the sun?
We don't. So the question is, how long did the blanket of ash block out the sun? And we really don't know. There have been computer models, months, maybe a few years. I mean, the effects would have been many decades. Mount Pinatubo, I was in Hawaii 3 years afterwards, and the sunsets were still a little bit weird. So the fine particulate material takes a long time to come down. Yeah. So the big mass extinctions, end of Ordovician was glaciation. The end of Devonian, we don't know, but it might have been the first forests. And we'll get to that next lecture. The Permian, Siberian traps, the volcanic eruptions and CO2 poisoning. The Triassic may also have been volcanism, and the meteorite impact for the end Cretaceous. And what I want to emphasize here is there seems to be no universal cause for the mass extinctions. They're different types of disaster that happen on very, very infrequently. And so now, what I'm going to do is turn to Elliot to the sources of meteorites.
Okay, so what I want to do is now think a little bit specifically about the role of collisions with solar system debris, meteors, and what kind of how to think about them in the larger context of what we know about the history of the solar system, and ultimately to think about how common are these types of collisions that produce the extinctions that Charles just talked about. So to remind you, the fact that the solar system is filled with debris in the form of asteroids and meteors is really a vestige of how the solar system formed. We think the solar system formed in this bottom-up way, where a cloud of gas collapsed into a rotating disk. In that rotating disk, you first had tiny little dust bunnies, which collided with each other and grew to form pebbles, and then collided with each other to form bigger rocks, and ultimately all the way up to form Earth-like planets, etc. And so the fact that the solar system is filled today still, and was 65 million years ago as well, filled with all these rocks floating around is really a kind of leftover signature of how the solar system formed, of this bottom-up process of small rocks colliding to form bigger and bigger rocks. That's really the key to how the planets formed. We've already seen some other examples of where this bottom-up process of planet formation has left its signature on the solar system today, the kind of spectacular cratering record that we can see on the surface of the moon. The existence of the moon itself, we think, is due to a collision with a Mars-sized object, Theia. That collision produced the tilt to the Earth's rotation axis, which, as we'll talk about next time, is responsible for the seasons. So the fact that we have the seasons we have really owes itself to the collision that formed the moon. So the kind of leftover debris in the solar system is roughly categorized as two different types of objects. We call objects that live usually most of the time in the outer part of the solar system comets. They're made of rock and dust and also ice. By contrast, we call the kind of debris that lives in the inner part of the solar system asteroids. That's made of rocks, metal, but not ice. And that difference, just to remind you, is also reflected in the composition of the planets themselves. The inner planets lack the ice and large volumes of large volumes of water in the form of ice, methane ice, etc., that are present in Neptune, Uranus, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so just like there's a difference in the composition of planets, there's also differences in the composition of the kind of debris left over from the beginning of the solar system. And that's really the fundamental difference between comets and asteroids. When comets pass sufficiently close to the sun, then the water and ice that's kind of locked into the main body of the comet starts evaporating, and that's part of what produces the dramatic cometary tails, is the evaporation of the water, both water as in H2O, but also other kinds of ices, methane, etc. And so you get these dramatic cometary tails. The actual comet, the main body of the object, is not necessarily different in size than an asteroid, a few hundred kilometers big, but these tails can be much more dramatic in size. And comets actually typically have two tails. That's kind of a detail that we're not going to go into. So where are today most of the asteroids and comets? Well, the asteroids, the objects in the inner solar system that don't have much ice but are mostly rock and metals, lie primarily in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And so if you look at the orbits of things in the solar system, in the inner solar system, you have the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Then you go further out to Jupiter. Between Jupiter and Mars lie most of the asteroids. And so really the way you should think of the asteroid belt, this place between Mars and Jupiter, is this is a region where lots of rocks exist today. They existed there when the solar system was forming, and they're basically the remnants of a failed planet. So the Earth, Jupiter, Mars, Venus initially consisted of these large rings of many, many rocks. As time went on, all of the rocks around the Earth's orbit collected to form the Earth, and so most of the rocks disappeared, getting absorbed into the Earth. In the asteroid belt, that didn't happen. And so we're left in the asteroid belt with all the rocks that couldn't collect together to form a planet. And the fundamental reason for that, we think, is that the asteroid belt is sufficiently close to Jupiter that Jupiter's gravity is strong enough that it's kicking the asteroids. It's exerting a gravitational tug on the asteroids that's causing them to move around very fast and chaotically, and that inhibits the asteroids in the asteroid belt from collecting together to form a planet. So the proximity to Jupiter and Jupiter's strong gravity inhibited the formation of a planet in the asteroid belt. And so today we're left with this remnant, which is all of the rocks that were present really at the beginning of the solar system, still there today in the form of the asteroid belt. Yep, question? Yeah, okay, good question. So where in this diagram is the frost line? The frost line, remember, is the distinction between where would ice sublimate, so be a gas, hydrogen, an oxygen gas, and where would it be in solid form? It's kind of between Jupiter and the asteroid belt. Yeah, good question. Okay. Most of the asteroids are here in this asteroid belt. You can see in this picture, right, there's a few that are in the inner part of the solar system. There's a few that look disturbingly close to the Earth, like maybe they would run into it once every 65 million years, something like that. And so, yep, question?
So those asteroids that currently are like hitting planets sometimes,
yep.
Are they only those asteroids that are in the inner circle, or is there a worry that asteroids from the asteroid belt?
Excellent question. So the question is, are the asteroids that we worry about, the ones that we worry might hit the Earth or have hit the Earth, etc., are those only the little ones here? Is it possible that things from the asteroid belt eventually get kicked into the inner solar system? I'm not going to answer that because I'm going to ask you that question in 5 minutes. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Good question. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on just what we call the near-Earth asteroids, the ones that are today relatively close to us and have a chance maybe of hitting the Earth. And so this shows you how many of these near-Earth asteroids are there. So this is a plot of the number of near-Earth asteroids larger than a given size. This is what is called a cumulative distribution. So the number larger than a given size. So this point here represents the number of asteroids larger than a kilometer. This represents the number of asteroids larger than 1/10 of a kilometer, etc. And there's really two lines here. Don't worry about all the differences here. Treat them as one. Expected is what we actually think is there. Detected is what we've actually been able to see with our telescopes. Okay? And just for a sense of scale, right, this roughly here is the size of the asteroid that produced the extinction of the dinosaurs. I should say, generally the term meteorite, really refers to something that has hit the Earth or is going through the Earth's atmosphere. So asteroid and comet are things that are out there somewhere in the solar system, and meteor or meteorite is something that's actually hit the Earth's atmosphere, burned up in the Earth's atmosphere, or hit the ground. Yep? Yeah, so this, good question. What period of time is this taken? So this is really a snapshot today. And so there's a couple of things to notice. First of all, this is a 100-meter big rock, which is pretty big. There's tens of thousands of those. And the really surprising thing, right, we have detected the remnant light from 380,000 years after the Big Bang, but we can't see most of the 100-meter asteroids that are on orbits very near the Earth. That's kind of astonishing, and that's just because they're actually really small and really faint. And so they're extraordinarily difficult to see. So most of the asteroids, smaller than a few hundred meters, we still have not actually detected. And so there's a major set of observational surveys today which are trying to find kind of all of these rocks, especially the ones that are a few hundred meters big. Those are the ones that would actually produce significant damage. These really tiny ones, where there's millions or hundreds of millions of them, they wouldn't actually cause much damage. These are the ones we worry about. If they hit a city, they would actually cause an interesting amount of damage. Okay, so this is the asteroid belt, which is really the origin of the asteroids. The comets largely originate from much further out in the solar system. Remember, comets are things that have ice, so again, they're coming from the outer, cooler part of the solar system, and they really originate in two different structures, one of which is called the Oort cloud, and the other of which is called the Kuiper belt, named after the astronomers who kind of speculated or theorized about them. The Oort cloud, we think, is actually a roughly spherical distribution of comets that extends almost out to the nearest stars. So remember, the next nearest stars to us are a few light years away, and the Oort cloud is this kind of collection of trillions of comets that extends roughly out to the nearest stars. Most of these we haven't seen. Really, we've only seen a few handful of comets, the ones that happen to pass very close to the inner part of the solar system. So this is a guess of how many are out there based on extrapolating the ones that we've actually seen. How did they get out there? We think the way they got out there is that when the solar system was forming, occasionally comets would pass very near Jupiter, and Jupiter's strong gravity would fling the comets into the outer part of the solar system onto these very elongated orbits. And so it's the gravity of the big planets, Jupiter and Saturn in particular, that kind of kicks things into the outer part of the solar system, creating this cloud of comets that kind of surrounds the solar system. The Kuiper belt is a kind of different type of object. It's not, or a different collection of objects, that's a little more accurate. It's not a sphere. It's closer to being a disk-like structure, like the planets in the solar system. The size of it is a little bit larger than the orbit of Neptune. So Neptune's distance is about 30 times the distance between the Sun and the Earth, and the Kuiper belt is just a little bit further out than that. So there's really these two collections of kind of reservoirs of comets in the solar system, this disk-like structure just beyond Neptune, and then this more spherical structure that extends all the way out really to the nearest star. Yep? Yeah, great question. So could these regions today undergo some kind of gravitational runaway and form a new planet? And we think the answer to that is no, that these regions over time have been depleted of objects. The number of objects in the Kuiper belt has gone down in time as they've collided with each other or been flung into the sun, or Jupiter has kicked them into the outer part of the solar system. And so today, there are kind of so few objects, even though there's millions of objects out there, there's so few relative to the early solar system that they're not going to undergo a gravitational runaway on timescales of tens or hundreds of billions of years. So a slight aside, but I want to mention, so last year there was a lot of excitement about Voyager 1, one of the kind of early satellites, reaching, quote, the edge of the solar system. And so this is actually pretty amazing, right? So we've launched a satellite which has traveled out past Pluto, past the Kuiper Belt. Okay, it's gone out into the outer reaches of the solar system. In this diagram, it's actually really out near the edge of the Kuiper Belt itself now. So what does it mean to say, though, that Voyager reached the edge of the solar system or reached interstellar space, given that we still have the Oort cloud out there? And so what they meant, what the press releases meant, what NASA meant by saying that Voyager had really reached the outer regions of the solar system was actually a very specific statement, a statement that's distinct from anything to do with the Kuiper Belt or the Oort cloud or where the planets are. What it really has to do with is what is the gas through which Voyager was moving. So the sun has a wind, and we call the region of space occupied by gas that originated from the sun. We call that the heliosphere, the sphere associated with the sun, heliosphere. That's gas that originated on the surface of the sun and then was blown out, filling up part of the solar system. As you go out, though, eventually you reach a transition point where suddenly you go from gas that originated on the sun to gas that is kind of more pristine interstellar gas that just fills the space between stars. And there is actually a relatively sharp boundary, which has this shape here, that demarcates gas that originated on the sun, shown in kind of the dark bluish stuff here, from gas that is just kind of residual gas that fills the space between stars. Anybody know why it has this shape? Any guess? Well, the solar wind is going out the same in every direction. The solar wind is basically spherical, so why is there this preferential shape in one particular direction?
Is it because the solar system is orbiting around the center of the galaxy?
Exactly. It's because the sun is moving, so it's the sun's direction of motion that picks out this particular direction. The sun is moving this way, and so this stuff is kind of trailing back behind the direction of motion. Exactly. And so Voyager, what Voyager actually did that everybody was excited about last year is it passed from the region of the solar system dominated by the solar wind to the region of the solar system dominated by interstellar gas. It passed this heliopause. This is about 120 astronomical units. So in this picture, it's somewhere between the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. Okay. Back to the Kuiper Belt. The first object in the Kuiper Belt was discovered in 1930. That was Pluto. In 1992, the second object in the Kuiper Belt was discovered. And since then, we've now discovered thousands of objects in this kind of disk of debris in the outer part of the solar system. Like the asteroid belt, we think this is kind of a remnant. This is material that did not collect into planets. These are planetesimals, icy rocks left over from the formation of the solar system that did not collect into planets. You can see some of the orbits here. The blue line is Pluto. The green is Neptune. The orange is Uranus. I'll come back to this other one in just a second. So I want to ask you a question now. How is it that some comets or asteroids end up on orbits that send them in towards the sun or the Earth? Most of the time, comets live happily in the outer part of the solar system, in the Oort cloud or the Kuiper Belt. Every once in a while, for some reason, they come orbiting in to the inner part of the solar system. That's when we see them, Halley's Comet, right, as these spectacular sources in the sky. And so what is it that sends comets or asteroids occasionally into the inner part of the solar system? Is it the gravity of a passing star? Is it the gravity of other asteroids? Is it Pluto, that ever-important object in the outer part of the solar system? Or is it Deus ex machina, dark matter? Okay? So talk to each other about that for a second. Okay, any guesses? I see some blues. Any other guesses? Hint, hint. There's more than one right answer. All right. So the Oort cloud is so far away, and it's near the nearby stars, that if a star happens to come close to our solar system, the gravity of that star can kick the comet in towards the inner part of the solar system. Similarly, asteroids that happen to pass near each other in the asteroid belt, or comets in the Kuiper belt that happen to pass close to each other, can get kicked into the inner part of the solar system. So you may have thought that I put dark matter up here as one of these crazy answers because I couldn't think of anything else. There was actually a paper published earlier this year that proposed that dark matter could send asteroids crashing into the Earth. I think that's completely crazy. For various reasons, I think this is wrong, but it was actually a real proposal in the scientific literature, so I didn't completely make that one up. So this object here in the Kuiper belt, I want to talk about this for a second. This is an object called Ares. This is actually the most massive object that we know outside of Neptune. This is a picture of Ares. Ares has a moon orbiting around it. So it's the most massive object outside of Neptune's orbit, the most massive object we know about in the Kuiper belt. Just to give you a sense of what its orbit looks like, so this shows kind of a top-down view of the orbits of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Ares. You notice that Pluto and Ares are different from Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn, and that their orbits are more elongated. They're more elliptical rather than circular. You'll also notice this is an edge-on view where Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn are all in the same plane. That signature of things forming in the protoplanetary disk out of which the solar system formed. Pluto and Ares are rather different. Their orbits are inclined relative to the orbits of the planets in the solar system. And so these are two of the reasons. The fact that Pluto is actually not the most massive object outside of Neptune's orbit. That distinction belongs to Ares. The fact that Pluto and Ares orbits are unusual relative to the planets in the solar system. These are two of the reasons that Pluto was eventually demoted from its planetary status to its current status as a dwarf planet, distinct from the kind of real planets in the solar system. So just to give you a sense of scale, so this is Ares with its moon, Dysnomia. I can never pronounce that right. This is Pluto. Pluto has actually a very large moon, Charon. These are some of the other large objects in the Kuiper belt with dramatic names like 2005 FY9, Sedna, Orcus, Quaoar. Almost all of these objects have been discovered by a single person. So if you want to blame one person for the demise of Pluto, it's this sadistic-looking person who's an astronomer at Caltech. He actually was a Berkeley graduate student who was famous for his entire time as a graduate student. He lived on a houseboat in the Berkeley Marina. He's really a spectacular scientist who's really taught us most of what we know about the outer solar system in the Kuiper belt. So this kind of debate about whether Pluto counts as a planet or not, I think is sometimes a little silly. But I do think there is a very interesting and important underlying scientific point, which is once we started to discover all of these objects in the Kuiper Belt, we kind of immediately realized that there really wasn't anything special about Pluto. It was one of many very similar objects in the orbit beyond Neptune in the Kuiper Belt. Pluto's orbit distinguishes it from the rest of the planets. It's much more similar to the Kuiper Belt in having an orbit that's a little bit different than the beautiful plane that the rest of the planets are in. Pluto isn't even particularly big relative to other objects in the Kuiper Belt. And so this debate about Pluto's status as a planet or not does tell us something deep. It tells us that what there really is in the outer part of the solar system isn't a bunch of other planets, but rather a collection of millions of comets left over from the formation of the solar system. And so that discovery of the Kuiper Belt is really a very important clue about the history and origin of the solar system. And it's fundamentally that discovery that led to the reclassification of Pluto as not being one of the core planets, but rather having this dwarf planet status. Okay, so I want to end in the last minute or two just by coming back to this question. So now we know of millions of comets in the Kuiper Belt, trillions of comets in the Oort cloud, again, millions of asteroids in the asteroid belt. So how often do those objects actually collide with the Earth or with other planets? How common are collisions like the collision that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs? We know that collisions in some form or another are actually very common. This is a spectacular preserved example in Arizona called Meteor Crater. This is a kilometer-sized diameter crater, several hundred meters deep. This is the visitor center for a sense of scale, right? This is really big. This was only, quote, only about a 25 to 50 meter diameter asteroid that hit about 50,000 years ago, producing this kilometer-sized crater. So just imagine, right, if this now hit in a city, that would be completely catastrophic. A kilometer-sized crater would mean the decimation of a major metropolitan area on Earth. In 1994, there was this gorgeous example where Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 collided with Jupiter. This is Io, one of the moons of Jupiter. This is Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 running into the surface of Jupiter, producing this flare of light. This movie's about an hour or so long, a few hours long. And for this very brief period of time, the comet crashing into the asteroid of Jupiter produced a source of light that was comparable in brightness to one of the moons of Jupiter. The comet actually broke up before it hit Jupiter. This gets back to Charles' point about the meteor comet asteroid that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, that it's quite possible that it actually broke up before it actually collided with the Earth. Last year, there was this impact in Russia, the Chelyabinsk meteor, which you can see coming in here. Right, this was about a 20-meter size diameter asteroid. This one happened to explode relatively high up in the atmosphere, which actually minimized the damage. Most of the damage was caused by what we call a sonic boom or an air blast. So it's not the direct impact, but it's actually a shock wave sent out through the atmosphere that then led to this building collapsing. This is actually another example of this very proud guy who dressed up in his Sunday best to show off this asteroid that crashed into his car. So just to come back to this question of how often does it happen? How much do you have to worry? So I've taken this plot of cumulative number of asteroids as a function of size, and I've added typical time between impact. Meteor crater-sized impacts actually happen probably every few thousand years. That's not that uncommon. So this is, this fact that the solar system is filled with debris, right, really still to this day, that memory of the solar system has a continued impact on Earth in terms of collisions of these smaller-sized objects and every once in a rare while, collisions with objects bigger than a few kilometers. We think a few kilometer diameters is the critical demarcation between when the collision has really a worldwide impact by putting enough debris into the atmosphere to create something like a nuclear winter. Okay, so next time we'll turn to start talking a little bit about climate change and habitability on geologic and kind of evolutionary timescales.